Okay, after the initial hiccups. Bhuvna, we are witness to worldwide unrest and conflict, and you have worked in post-conflict countries, uh, where we have seen the young rise and they have taken charge. How do you feel? What are your reflections on democracy and leadership, particularly in respect to those countries where you have worked?
Um, so over the past few years, I've had the opportunity to work in several post-conflict countries and learn from what's happening there. One thing we all know from watching the news very simply is that there is the scale of conflict is increasing. Primarily both, sort of intranational conflict, which is rather new to the rest of the world. We always knew there was a lot of international conflict, for example, in Africa. But outside of Africa, especially say in Asia, the Middle East, we're now seeing it in countries like the US. And of course, to top it up, the international conflicts that are already ongoing. We're seeing all sorts of conflict. Not just are they purely political and civil conflicts. They're also now on economic dimensions. They're on personal and social dimensions. And they're taking on, they're resulting in an enormous amount of churn in various parts of the world. We've seen it in the Arab Spring. We've seen it, for example, in Afghanistan more recently. We've seen it with Occupy Wall Street in the US. More recently in India, especially with the governance lapses. So we're seeing a lot of rebellion, dissent, and to top it all, disenfranchisement. This feeling that we don't have a voice, that nobody's listening to us. It's largely people on the margins that are trying to negotiate for space, for voice, for recognition. And to say that we are here and we ought to be listened to. It's not enough that you take our vote when it's time to take our vote, but you also need to come back to us with XYZ as expected. However, what has happened is that we're seeing this typical movement in the life of any such rebellion or uprising, if you will. Typically, it starts with a lot of furor. It begins with a tremendous amount of simmering discontent. It is followed typically by aroused passion. There's a lot of noise around it. There is a lot of ethically charged conversation around it. The third is, of course, it's built on brotherhood. It's a lot of different kinds of people coming together and finding this common ground out of nowhere. It suddenly pushes a lot of the other differences out to the margin. But what's happening is that it gets split apart. It gets split apart by dissent, and it gets split apart by dissipated leadership. Now, this we've seen again and again and again, and we're not able to find what is that magic pill that will help us go beyond just rising to getting to some conclusion. So, for example, when you think about what happened in December in India, we see that people came together and said, this is not done. We will not accept lapses in rule of law, especially against our women. Yet, we didn't see follow-through. We saw a lot of powerful conversation around it. We saw dharnas and morchas and sit-ins, but we didn't see reasonable, sensible conclusion that will in any way guarantee a change. We see the same thing in Arab Spring countries. We see that, very simply in Tunisia, it was just started by a simple case of a street vendor being bullied by the police. It was that small a thing. It was a tremendous domino effect, but it dissipated. After it, we didn't see a conclusive change in the model of governance. We didn't see that this was now going to become a lasting process in any of these countries. Egypt, for example, has gone back. Is turning around. It was democracy, was the kind of democracy nobody liked, but suddenly we find that it's going to be a dictatorship that nobody likes. How do you negotiate that split? So in my experience in some of these countries, I'll reflect on some of them. In Afghanistan, for example, in South Sudan, for example, also in Sri Lanka, all three countries have had a significant youth movement that has been a part of the counterculture, of the rebellion, if you will. And there are some lessons that we learn. The first of these lessons, and I think that these are important not just in terms of democracy, but also in terms of the kinds of lives that we want to lead and be part of. The first of these lessons is, what are the first principles that are guiding a particular revolution or a particular change of guard, right? What is not just the issues or the bones of discontent, but the first principles, meaning rule of law, economic freedom perhaps. Democracy is, of course, a lot of the times, what kind of system of governance will it be? So immense clarity on the first principles. The second is participative decision making? Is there not just a brotherhood of people coming together, but how that brotherhood is now deciding what the next steps are? What is the strategy? What is the conclusion? What do we do once we reach a critical inflection point? The third is dealing with disagreement, and this is where most movements fall apart. How do you deal with voices that do not agree with your grand vision within that brotherhood? What happens? How do you negotiate that minefield? Not just negotiate the minefield, how do you then take into account what this dissent is trying to tell you? And the last is discipline. You know, the previous live speaker also mentioned discipline. Not just discipline in terms of your daily schedule, but also discipline and rigor in the way you think about an issue, how you break an issue down, how you identify what your response to a particular situation will be. And we see that these lessons are particularly pertinent, not just in a political democracy, but also very simply in what kinds of families do we want to raise? You know, what kinds of communities do we want to be a part of and nurture? What kinds of business decisions will we help lead? I think this sort of sums up some of my key reflections, and I hope that you know, you'll take some values from these, not just from a political and social change point of view, but also in a personal life point of view.
Thank you. Just a quick word on the format. We will request each of the panelists to speak for 6 minutes. We will open it up for questions, after which they will conclude with concluding comments about a minute or two each. So we will have time for interaction. Thank you, Bhuvna, and this actually leads very well into the next panelist, who is Giovanna Mingarelli. It's working? Okay. A crowdsourcing expert, a public speaker and a writer, and the principal and co-founder of NC Consulting. She brings critical solutions to how companies, organizations, and governments can fuse traditional communication with new media. And actually that brings me to my next question, because having talked about the Arab Spring and the issues that Bhuvna brought up, Giovanna, what is the role of social media, since you work in that area, particularly in what was known as the Arab Spring, and how do you see the role of young people and leadership in that respect?
Thank you. I just want to start off by saying it really is an honor and a privilege to be here. Also a little frightening at this point in time because it's right before lunch and I think everyone's probably really hungry. So please bear with me. But it's a humbling experience because I got involved in politics at the age of 15, so about 15 years ago. And it started off with an internship on Parliament Hill, and I was just really excited to get involved in something that was inspiring to me, and I wanted to make a difference, and I wanted to, you know, contribute to my community in some way that seemed to be meaningful. And that led me down an interesting path. Politics, as it is, can be a little bit crooked. It can be a little dangerous, especially for someone who's young, getting involved, but it can also be really, really rewarding and incredibly inspiring, being surrounded by leaders who genuinely care and who genuinely want to make a difference in the world. So you get a mix of both. By the age of 20, I was working in the Prime Minister's office in Canada, in the press office, and I decided a few years later that I wanted to leave politics because I saw that the natural extension of political organization was going online. So this was at a time when Facebook was just coming out of universities and it was being opened up a little bit more broadly. And a couple years earlier, Howard Dean's campaign in the States had just integrated social media to a certain degree into their political campaign. And so at this point, I really, given my passion for people and organization and wanting to make a difference, decided to enter the tech industry. So one thing led to another, and I ended up founding my own consultancy after working at a few different tech startups, focusing specifically on how can governments, organizations work with young people specifically in bridging the digital-physical divide, in getting people to take action on meaningful social causes that are both important and can actually make a difference in the world. One thing we know based on recent research out of NYU, Professor Clay Shirky recently published a novel called The Cognitive Surplus, which contends that the single most natural untapped resource in the world are human good intentions that never translate into action. There's 1.7 billion millennials on the planet. So these are people between the ages of 15 and 30. And we know that these people are the most likely individuals to take action for one another, for a cause, or even for a government if they're provided with the right tools and incentives to do so. And so there are many different ways and means by which organizations or political parties or candidates have been involved, have been using different kinds of social media like Facebook, Twitter, Foursquare, more recently, so on. President Obama's 2008 presidential campaign was a really great example of this. He crowdsourced $500 million in donations of $100 or less, which was a watershed, really, in the context of political organization and the capacity for candidates to go beyond traditional fundraising and to actually go work with the people, and in particular, allowed youth to be able to contribute their own resources in a way that was meaningful and important. Just a couple months ago, I was actually fortunate to visit the White House and to speak with the President's office actually about a new form of social engagement that goes beyond the current social media network. And this involves crowdsourcing global, national, and local actions through the use of what are called micro-actions. So taking one big cause, event, or campaign, breaking it down into little pieces that anyone anywhere can do, and then being rewarded for completing those tasks. So in this case, If We're in the World is a really great example of a platform that I've used in the past to run political campaigns in Canada, where you can, for instance, take an election campaign, and one activity could be putting up a poster sign, one activity could be voting, one activity could be driving your grandparent to a polling station, and so on. And then the aggregate sum of all these combined activities grouped together can help solve really big problems or can help accomplish incredible goals that we can't do on our own. So the exponential capacity for growth, combined with an ability to filter all our different actions together in a cohesive, meaningful way, is starting to bridge our ability to take physical, real-world action and to apply it to causes that are important and meaningful. This is also the foundation, so crowdsourcing in this context, and micro-actions and so on, is also the foundation of one of my new startups, MC2, which is a mobile app that lets people take action on different causes and activities, break them down into bite-sized pieces that we can do, and then win points and prizes for completing those tasks. Now, how is this relevant to the documentaries, right? We've been talking about film, we've been talking about video production. This has been something that's been coming up quite a bit. And I was speaking with one of my good friends in Ottawa a few weeks ago who works with IMAX about this documentary that came out recently about the Arctic and about the melting of the ice caps and how polar bears are being terribly affected. He was saying it's so terrible because we have all these students coming to see this amazing documentary, and it's beautifully crafted, incredibly well done, but then they leave feeling so sad about the polar bears and the ice caps, but they don't know what to do. So they just feel guilty about it, and there's no way to actually take action on what we're doing. You can't save a polar bear with a Facebook like necessarily, right? You need to actually have physical activities that you can engage in. And so one of the ways that we were imagining integrating activities into, for instance, this kind of documentary is by creating an action quest. You know, you've seen the movie, now take action, do something about it. And I think that this is one of the missing pieces in our existing social network, is the ability to bridge the digital-physical divide, the intention with the action. So I just want to finish this off by considering the fact that while social networks and different forms of social media can be incredibly productive, can be incredibly empowering, we have to remember that they, in and of themselves, are just different conduits for enabling us to take social action in the real world. They, in and of themselves, are not sufficient to help solve the world's problems. We must be the leaders. We must have the ethical drive to promote the causes and activities that are meaningful to us. We cannot rely necessarily on our governments in order to make this happen. We have to start with ourselves. I was recently speaking with the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Boutros-Ghali, about this exactly, about microactions and how they can play out in our lives. Now, he's a little bit older now, and from when he was in service. But one of the things that he had to say to me at the end of our discussion was, you know, it's great to have these different social vehicles to engage. But at the end of the day, what matters is that we have ethical leaders, right, in and of themselves, who live selflessly with the thought of helping others, with the thought of enabling more transformative, transparent, and trustworthy institutions. And with that intention, given the right tools, then anything is possible. But without that intention, no tool in the world is going to make the changes that we want to see, and no tool in the world is going to transform our eroding democratic institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Giovanna. It is my pleasure now to introduce the next panelist, Professor William Godely, who insists that he should also be called Bill, or only called Bill. Professor Godely is the Associate Professor of Social Studies and Education and the coordinator of the program in Social Studies at Teachers College, Columbia University. His research areas include global citizenship education, media as curriculum tools, and teacher education development. Professor Godely, the spread of democracy across the globe has taken place at the same time as the rise of inequity and inequality. It would be interesting to hear from you your perspective, especially in the context of leadership, spirituality, and sustainability.
Thank you for that question. And I'd first like to thank deeply, and not in an obligatory way at all, but the work of Mr. Shiv Khemka and Ms. Gauri Ishwaran. I've been very pleased to play a very small part in this project over the past 6 years, and it's truly wonderful to see it flourishing as it is. I'm very honored to be a part in a small way of that process. I'd like to begin with what I see as a yawning gap between a structural understanding of democracy and an understanding of democracy as a life lived. And it's a rather simple way to think about it, but it's a useful way. Because often we think about democracies as having elections and engaging in issues of citizenship, the media, et cetera, and those things are important, but they are not in and of themselves enough. I'm really borrowing heavily here on the work of John Dewey with a notion of democracy that is engaged in living conjointly through communicative experiences and with a plentitude of information. It's a really complex way of saying something quite simple, which is how to live fully and to live in a mindful way about one's life. This, to me, is what's missing. And I think it speaks to the issue of equity, in that people can live as though there is equity when there is not, because they can insulate themselves from it, from an awareness of those that have and those that do not, and those that have access to power and those that do not. So I think it's that sensitivity that comes through an awareness of how one lives fully and organically within a community that I'd like to address in particular. I think it's instructive to us that the spirituality session is separate from the democracy session. I'd like to see those commingled, because to me, that democracy ultimately ends, I think, in aesthetic experience or a feeling experience, something opposite of an anesthetic experience. So that to be fully present in the world, to be fully engaged in one's community, is to have an aesthetic sensitivity about how one lives in the world. And it, to me, fundamentally is a spiritual sense of being. Dewey recognized these limitations and eventually wound himself out of thinking democracy as just about education and just about structures, and more about a sense of being that is transcendent, and that has the potential to involve all people in its fold. So I think we need to focus more on the latter. And we have often seen how the structures of government can easily be subverted. There's a great piece in yesterday's New York Times by Thomas Friedman that talks about the global economy a la China, and in particular the corruption that occurs within the government, and people have a mentality of serving oneself and not serving the social or the commonwealth, and how that threatens the planet because of this instrumentality of China in the global economy. So I'd recommend this piece if you need some evidence as to why the corruption group, for example, is a global issue, even though it's happening in one particular nation state. And it happens in every nation state, as we know. My own personal take on this in the community that I live in, just in the suburbs or exurbs of New York City, I'm a small elected official on the local board of education. And in that role, I get to see how democracy is understood by constituents and how I see it as a member of that panel. And I'd say the biggest problem we have is that people view, in particular education, they view their right to have what they want when they want it without a recognition of the social dimensions of education. So what I try to reframe for people is, how do we begin to think about not just our child's education as important, of course we all do, but also every child as being part of the community of children that we need to serve, not just here in our town, and not just here in our state or in this country, but globally. And it's that kind of a transformative move that we need to, I think, reinvigorate democratic values, one, of the interdependence of people, and two, of the ethical commitment of people to help those who are not being served by a public system. I'll tell you a short conversation that I had with a parent, and this was in a public group meeting where she shared with me, as these parents did, they're lesbian and gay parents. There's about 10% of our population in this town are people who've moved out of Brooklyn and come to the suburbs to attend the public school. And they happen to be same-sex partners, they have children, and they were commenting on the fact that many of the kids in school still make fun of their kids as a result of that. She shared something with me that was a bit upsetting. She said, "I don't care about the other kids who may hate gay people, I only care about my kid." And so I pushed back and I said, isn't it ironic that in a claim to the Commonwealth, you're making a claim that is personal and only personal? Because the treatment of your child is as important as the treatment of that child who's making the slur. So to put this in the context of bullying in schools, it's not just about the bully and the victim, but the bully is also a victim. And recognizing that as the complexity of what it means to live in a democratic society. So getting people out of the mindset of it's just about serving me and getting them to think about the mindset of serving the Commonwealth is one that I think is a great struggle. I spent the earlier part of this week visiting a school in Thailand that is attempting to embrace these values across the board, holistic education that's democratic and organic and really grounded in the community. I first visited last summer and I was so attracted to the spirit and the ethos of this place that I literally had to come back. So I went back and spent 3 more days with them. Mealtime perhaps is the most amazing democratic experience there because the children prepare the meals for each other and they clean up after each other and they learn about the process of food production in the doing of that work. Faculty do the same. So they're not served by food service staff, they're served by each other, and they clean up after each other, and then learn about sustainability through composting and the use of water. I mean, it really embraces the notion that it's a whole way of being. It's not simply something we assign to someone else in a government sector. I think I may be running out of time, so I'll try to wrap up. But the experience of taking a common meal has the potential to be a democratic project if we frame it as such. And I think that's where we find value in reinvigorating democracy. I can't share this now because I don't have the time, but there's an organic farm that I visited in Hawaii recently that is an amazing example of people working together, who, by the way, are part of the poorest sector in that society, to reinvigorate democratic values and organic farming and traditional ways of being Hawaiian within that context that's truly amazing. But I'm writing it in my book, and so I'll come and give you a copy of the book next year, and you can see it for yourselves. I think the trouble of democracy in our time is that we are led into insularity, and modernity allows us to believe as though and to behave as though we're not affecting and affected by those around us. And I think that's the primary problem, is to recognize our interdependence on the planet with other sentient beings, and a recognition of how that understanding can develop an aesthetic experience that truly speaks to our humanity and is uplifting for all people, not simply those who have and those who have not, but all people that share in the Commonwealth. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for also highlighting once again how we are being, as you said rightly, led into insularity, and how our discourse and our language is also changing from the collective noun of the family, the state, the nation, to me, myself, I. I think we are seeing the reflection on it on a daily basis. I'll conclude this session with a small story. I was told, the speaker of the Bihar Assembly told me a story about how he was traveling through a small village in Jharkhand, where there was a woman sitting in a hut, which is a village hut, and she had this basket of strawberries. And so he stopped and he asked her, what does it cost? And she said, by 5 rupees a bunch. And he said to her, sell me the whole basket, which would have cost 200 rupees. And this old frail woman looks at him and says, Babuji, agar aap ye le jayenge, to gaon ke log kya khayenge? Meaning, if you buy this and take it, what will the villagers eat? She wasn't thinking of targets. She wasn't thinking of sitting home. She wasn't modernized into thinking the way we are. She was thinking of the larger community and what she, as the small seller of this fruit, can contribute towards the community feeling happy eating those little strawberries. I'll now open up the session to questions with a request that you please introduce yourself, address the question to the panelists, and please keep the question short.
That or we could all go to lunch and have a common meal.
Good afternoon. Thank you for speaking to us. My question is for Ms. Mingarelli. I was especially interested in the app you mentioned and how it helps people who are interested in taking up social work complete a mission through little steps. How did you develop this app, and how has the response been?
Okay, so we've been working on developing MC2 for the last year and a half, and we're piloting it this September. So we're launching it on 2 national campaigns in Canada, and so to that effect, it's still coming. It hasn't launched yet, but I'd be very happy to share it with you when it is available. The process in developing it has been very interesting in the sense that it was very much inspired by the first web startup that I had mentioned, If We Ran the World, which I had used quite extensively in politics with different NGOs, not-for-profits, and the process of breaking down campaigns like a white ribbon campaign or a national awareness initiative or other kind of national awareness initiative or election campaign it's so different than the traditional kinds of social media, right? It's different to create a tangible action that someone can do when they wake up in the morning versus, just liking something or which is also important, and you need all kinds of different social media to share those activities. But the process of creating it real, making it real, and integrating that activity and that cause into your life is really a very rewarding thing. And over time, as you kind of aggregate together all those different activities you're doing, you start to realize that you yourself are in fact defined by the actions that you take. And you start to see the actions that you're taking. And often we go through life and I pick up my iPad, this is something, right? I pick up a water bottle, this is something. I say hi to a friend, this is something. And so we have these series of activities that we undertake on a day-to-day basis that we're not aware of, that we don't perceive, and that are completely unconscious. And through this kind of platform, you're able to actually become aware of what you're doing and of where you're going. And so I find that to be a very interesting aspect as well.
Hi, thanks for your comments. It's a question for Professor Gaudelli. You talk about the move towards sort of potentially thinking about us, me and individuals rather than the common good and the commonwealth. But as we move increasingly towards a global society, how should we understand that commonwealth? Especially when our democratic institutions are still typically nation states or more local organizations?
That's an excellent question. I think we're in the process of rethinking the nation state, and you see lots of evidence of this around the world. And you see lots of movements back towards the nation state and even to smaller subdivisions. So I don't think it's a nice, neat, linear model of evolution, but I do think there's a flexing of borders, and there's a dynamism and a plasticity that's happening now that we're all witnessing that will lead eventually to some type of a new system, structure that we cannot yet envision. I know this is an effusive answer. I'm not purposely doing this, but I don't think we can say yet what it will be. But I do think eventually we'll have a system where it is not so bound by nation states. Because nation states cause lots of troubles. There's nothing natural about them. They're really an outgrowth of 1648 in that period of time. So they didn't exist before that, and they won't always exist in the form that they do now. So things have their day, and they had their day, but I also think that there was a great deal of violence associated with them, and counterproductivity in terms of establishing a good relationship with the biosphere that we are really undermining. I mean, a good example of that, and one that I'm embarrassed to mention, but I think deserves mentioning, is that the United States delegation went to the Protocol Summit for climate change and basically said, if you start to talk about proportionality, we leave the meeting. And that's very disconcerting to me that leaders in our country would say that, to make that claim. I understand the politics of it, but we need to get beyond that. And so the problems that are on the near horizon that are beginning to occur will beckon a new system. I don't know what that system is. My hope is that it will be a system that promotes more justice and more ecological balance, but I can't be sure of that. But I think a new system is on the offing, and we're in the stages of wondering what that will be. Europe went headlong into a supranational system that was continental. There have been a lot of concerns about how that's happened, although there's still hope that it will continue. So it's not much of an answer. It's the best I can do. We're in the process of figuring something new out.
I'd just like to supplement what you're saying. A friend recently said something very interesting. She said, we're all being ruled by people who thought about boundaries and borders, right? So the way they looked at the world was maps with lines drawn on them. However, all of the citizens, like the millennials, if you will, they live in a very different world. So we don't think twice before, a conversation or showing solidarity on an issue that's happening on Occupy Wall Street or in the Middle East or wherever else it may be. Our world is very different, just conceptually very different. So I think one interesting thing that we're also saying is we're realizing that aggregation in terms of rule is not quite working. But aggregation has simple merits in terms of public administration. So what you're going to see, I suspect, is a change from talking about rule or talking about leadership to talking about administration, where the aggregation of the world concept or democracy is about values that you share, but really the units of administration are much smaller. So it's aggregation in a very, very different sense. So it won't be about flags and boundaries and borders. It'll just be about what is it that's going to get us, say, rule of law. What is it that's going to help the man in the street get on his business? What is it that's going to help us, sort of build better software, or whatever it is that helps our business? But it isn't anymore going to be about representation in the way that we typically think about it, which is us versus them. Who gets to eventually be part of the majority? I think that conversation is going to change completely.
That's a better answer.
Maybe another question?
Yeah, just I don't know how small or big it is. Okay. You're talking about how this discussion, I think if it went on, it'd talk about how democracy is changing, how we govern is changing, governing our countries or nations. And I feel democracy is reliant on education. And I'm wondering how we're going to change the way we govern our countries, keeping variability of education in mind?
I guess I would flip it and say that education needs to be more democratic. And that would be the pathway to developing a more democratic, organic life. And I'm not sure that addresses the question, but that's how I see it, that I think that's the place where you germinate these values and attitudes among young people. And then as they grow older, it's natural for them. It's normal. It's the way they'll run their company. It's the way they'll live next to their neighbor in their community. It's how they'll be. But we don't do a lot of that. We do a lot of imposition and coercion, motivation through other means, rather than having them buy into the notion of commonality and recognizing the individual's importance to the social fabric. So that has to start at families, and it has to start in communities, it has to start in schools. We're far away from that, I think, unfortunately. Sure.
Yes, sir.
I love what you said in terms of, what are we teaching our children at the base. But there's also the question of systemic education. And education is one of the issues that's very, very close to me. I used to work in an organization that did a lot of advocacy with education. Well, one of the things that's happened worldwide is this movement towards a centralized education system, right? So a one-size-fits-all. And there are certain merits to it, meaning that at least everybody, you ensure common minimum standards for everybody, right? But in that quest for common minimum standards, what happens is that you lose out on all sorts of education. For example, there's somebody who's teaching their child, how do you live ecologically? There's somebody else who's only teaching their child science and math, because that's what their preference is. But suddenly you've got a one-size-fit-all, because, for example, in India, you've got the right to education. And the way we're thinking about it is, let's have a school system that has all of these minimum standards, that is exact one-size-fit-all, to the point where, you need 4 teachers per classroom, you need X, Y, Z per classroom, etc. But if you thought about it very differently and you said, what if there were 1,000 different types of schools that germinated and parents really picked and chose? Some parents, like for example my brother, choose to homeschool their children. There are other parents who may decide that they want, sort of factory-style education for their children. But all sorts of magic starts to happen. And then you have children that are learning to live in a very, very complex world instead of trying to simplify and put it in a box. So I think even in terms of, education, just thinking systemically in what will work to help us reinforce that kind of complex fabric of society is fairly important.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, are there any more questions? I'm going to ask one. I'm going to be devil's advocate and ask just one last question before I invite the panelists to sum up, particularly since there are so many young people in this room. And Giovanna, if I may ask the question of you, with this social media, and of course we've seen what's happened in the Arab Spring, etc., do you think that there is a danger of political ghettoization by the use of social media? Because really, you're talking to people across the globe who are like you, and you leave out the fringes. You leave out people who do not have access, who do not have the voice, and therefore the movement becomes the movement of people who are like yourselves. And that's the danger we see in the media, in everything else. The media reports on what affects them, what moves their heart. So the cyclone in Orissa won't get as much coverage as the bomb blast in Mumbai, because people like us go to hotels like the Taj. We don't live on the coastlines. So, it's a dangerous trend. And do you see that happening with the use of social media for political participation?
Yeah, well, there's a very fine line in terms of how much we can share and how inclusive we must be. In any society, in any community, and digital communities are like our own communities, except they have different boundaries and barriers and rules and regulations. We are going to have fringe groups, as you say, right? We have groups like Anonymous that are fully and completely operating on their own terms, which is very interesting, right?
My question is of access, so those who don't have access.
Those who don't have access to
social media.
It is, yes. So this is actually quite a problem, and I'll tell a story about this just quickly. So in northern Canada, in Nunavut, it's a territory. There are very, very low access to broadband because the data plans are prohibitively high. Poverty rates are over the top, and youth suicide rates are very high. Part of the reason that the government is attributed to this is a lack of connectivity and a lack of inclusiveness. And quite a bit is being done to try and actually connect a lot of these youth with the rest of the world. Social media is not the right way to do it in that case. When we're marketing or trying to share news stories with youth there, it has to be via other means, via radio, via poster. I mean, you may not have heard this in a long time, but by fax brochures, right? Like, these are different kinds of media that need to be used and that need to be engaged. And so to suggest that social media in every part of the world is, the enabling factor, is the right form of social engagement is wrong. And there are still parts of the world that require different forms, traditional forms of media, depending on the situation.
Thank you. Bhavna, would you like to sum up in about a minute?
I will take up from what Giovanna was saying.
Just finding them last.
I'm of a slightly different point of view. I think that media, especially internet-based media, is amazingly democratic. And it doesn't have the same barriers of instruments that traditional media had. So for example, today, even if you have only one computer in a village, it means 85 people in that village suddenly have access to the outside world, which they never did before, right? Huddling in front of one television set is very different than being able to take turns using the internet or using XYZ. And you see it, for example, in Rajasthan here, where we tried to get communities to monitor the performance of schools using the internet and recording teacher attendance, for example. It changed the way schools operate. And so there's tremendous amounts of potential, and I wouldn't for the fear that not everybody has access, necessarily close it down. I think just to sum up the entire discussion, at least my impression of it, there are 2 or 3 different things that we need to think about. One is, of course, the personal, right? Democracy and leadership and ethics in our own lives, and what does that mean in terms of building a better citizenry? So I think that's important. I think education plays a role there. I think social media plays a role in charting the kinds of citizens that we want as part of this global world, right? The second is, of course, paving the way in terms of systems, because that you cannot discount the role that systems play. You see this all the time. Like, for example, there is a move towards democracy, but suddenly there's a certain amount of discomfort with what that democracy is proposing, and then there is retraction, right? So that the only safeguard against it is really building solid first principles based systems. So I think that's the second thing to focus on. The third thing to focus on, of course, is to understand why there are gaps and chasms. So you talked about inequity, both of access as well as of outcome. But if you think about very simple things like, what is it that people typically get upset about? What is not working? We talk about ecological imbalance. And a lot of places where there has been an ecological imbalance, we've seen it's primarily because of lack of property rights for the community that lived there. They didn't have access to the lands that they'd been already managing for centuries. So thinking through those kinds of root questions is probably going to help us save us a lot of trouble in the future.
Thank you, Bhavna. And Bill, the last word from you.
Oh, I would say that education is fundamentally democratic if it's worthy of the name education, and that with that in mind, that democracies have to really attend to education that is democratic, because they'll never get a society that's democratic when its education is not. And that's what you're seeing in Egypt, and that's what you're going to see throughout the world, because you're not going to have a vibrant democracy and a vibrant society without those principles taught at a young age, and they're not.
Thank you. In conclusion, I think there is no doubt that democracy is the light. But I think we have to be aware where there is light, there are shadows, and we have to continue to light those lamps to dispel the shadows. So thank you for being with us and for extending your lunch break, sort of extending your time with us so that you can come and have lunch now, I think. So I invite you to have lunch, and thank you for attending this. Okay.
I'd like to begin by thanking all our speakers for an extremely interesting discussion. TGELF would like to present a token of their appreciation to all our esteemed panelists. We begin with Ms. Giovanna Mingarelli. Shobana Anand. Professor William Gaudelli. And last but certainly not the least, our moderator, Ms. Radhika Batra. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause for all our panelists, please.